She's just a kid. She's not ready to play a wife. That's not a choice you make at 9. She'll be heading to play outside. She's got a voice, but it's silent. She's not a choice, like she's mine. No, this pain ain't right, man. Love is a dream, not a nightmare. Vows she made, how she's ate. How's this straight? Housing rape? How's this faith? How's this change? How did we let her down this way? Countless days she's felt this pain. Now she's laid, she can't sleep. Still she weeps, still he beats her down each day. Loud she prays. Who'll speak for us? Nobody's speaking up. Put the pieces up. Somebody please pick up. Somebody please pick up. Somebody please pick up. Mascara drips down her face. Darling, slim down your waist. You don't love him no more. You wanna get out this cage. Trapped in pain, that display. She's not happy, that's just fake. But she feels so out of place. She can't run though, that's disgrace. You live in that place between hoping and coping. You're hoping that somebody notice you're choking. What's coping with all of this rage back at home? I'm praying you won't have to face it alone. Cracking on, lacking hope, packing up, flagging up with some folk that you love, but you don't. And you just battle on, so alone, never know where to go. Don't give up, get the phone, get in touch, let them know. They told you be quiet. They told you to diet. All of that hurt inside you. They told you to hide it. Why can't we change this? We probably don't want to face this, but it's clearly abuse. It's time to make some changes. Who'll speak for us? Nobody's speaking up. Put the pieces up. Somebody please pick up.
It's time to make some changes. Let's speak up. Let's pick the pieces up. That is what Press Red is all about. It's my privilege to welcome everyone to our first ever Press Red online conference. My name is Rosemary Hack, and I've been leading Press Red since March, which was a very interesting time to take over a ministry that thrives on face-to-face interaction. We're all about advocating, training, educating, speaking out about abuse, stopping the silence. It says in Proverbs 31 that we can be a voice for the voiceless. But more than that, we want to give people a voice to speak up for themselves, and we will speak alongside them. Today, we're taking advantage of being online. We've speakers from all over the world, peppered with input and testimonies from people in the UK. I encourage you to watch this conference today. Don't leave it till later. Some of it will be online, will be left online to see later, but some of the testimonies will not be left up online, because we need to protect those who share some of the hardest parts of their lives with us. That's a part of giving a safe voice to people who may otherwise be voiceless. So the only way to get the entirety of this event is to stay tuned today. We're going to go until just after noon, then we'll have a good long break for a couple of hours and reconvene at 2 p.m. for a couple more hours. Now, you might have got this invitation from a friend, you might have found it online, you might be wondering what on earth Press Red is. We are a UK-based NGO, or charity as we say in the UK. We're a couple of years old, and we want to lift the lid on all sorts of violence against women, be it domestic abuse, be it female genital mutilation, honour killings, all that whole gamut of abuse. We educate, we advocate, and we network to say that abuse and violence against women is just not acceptable. Our theme today is Roots and Fruits. That's the causes and consequences of abuse. We want to especially focus on the Christian community. We're Christians, and it's easy to point our fingers at others. But when we do that, we need to remember that we've got 3 fingers pointing back at us, right? So let's put our own house in order. This little clip explains what I mean by the roots and fruits of abuse against women. We want to take a look at the roots and fruits of violence against women. You see, this tree is representing the woman's life. It should be green and beautiful and bearing much wonderful fruit. But instead, what do we see growing on it? We see physical harm, emotional harm, economic harm. We see a life lived in shame, possible homelessness, a vulnerability to all sorts of exploitation.
We see women that are isolated. Horrific things such as honor killings, people living in fear, and ultimately suicide. There are things like FGM, labor and sex trafficking, female foeticide and infanticide are two very real things. Child marriage is an awful reality, and pornography, the devaluation of women. So there must be something happening. People weren't born like this. What happened to make this woman's life this way? Well, maybe people were just ignorant, and that can happen. Also, growing up in patriarchal societies, and it is a patriarchal world, where culture dictates how women are treated rather than God. Religion is also guilty. People often have a lack of compassion. Both men and women will have a lack of compassion for other women. There are many assumptions about the roles of a woman and the roles of a man, and you need to fit into them. There's some bad theology going around, some bad interpretation of the Bible, and woundedness of both men and women. There are lies, just plain lies that people tell. And of course, our old friends, sexism and misogyny.
Okay, so we want to get straight into the teaching here. This year, I came across this book by Australian author and theologian Kevin Giles, The Headship of Men and the Abuse of Women. Are they related in any way? I found it was a really captivating read. You can see it's all marked up. But it was an easy read as well. And what Kevin says makes so much sense. So I thought it would be great to get his input at this conference. So I emailed one of the few people that I know in Melbourne to see if he knew him. And amazingly he did. Put us in contact, and the rest is history. In the first session, Kevin outlines what abuse against women is and its extent. He's mainly focusing on domestic or intimate partner abuse in this instance. Now, this is teaching. We're not tickling your ears. We're not entertaining you. You will want a notebook and a pen by your side. So let's kick off with the first of Kevin's sessions.
Well, hello. I'm speaking to you from Melbourne, Australia, where we're in almost complete lockdown because of COVID-19. We're supposed to wear a mask every day, but I think I'll do much better if I speak to you without a mask. I'm in St Thomas's Church, Burwood, right at the centre of the universe, as you'll see from this little visual. And Joshua Millard, our associate minister, is helping me with the filming. I'm an Australian, but I've lived in England 4 times. In the 1970s, I studied at Durham University for a postgraduate degree in New Testament, and at the same time founded a satellite church, or I think we say today planted a satellite church in Garden Farm Estate, just out of Chester-Lee Street. So I know England very well, and I've travelled in America lecturing 4 times, and I've travelled quite widely in Africa, India and Southeast Asia, so I'm aware of what's going on in the rest of the world. You probably ask why, as an Australian of all people, been asked to speak on domestic abuse in this little series. Well, there's a couple of reasons. First, I'm one of the very few evangelicals in the world, you probably count them on one hand, who's actually written on domestic abuse from a Christian perspective. And secondly, I've been a keen student of what the Bible actually teaches about women for about 40 years. I've written a lot on this, and right at the heart of the Christian response to this very troubling matter of domestic abuse and violence is what we believe as Christians. Do we believe that men should be in charge of the home and the church, and women be submissive in all things, as Paul says in Colossians? Or do we actually believe that God has made us fully equal, and the subordination of women is the consequences of the fall, and we should as Christians oppose that? And we'll come back to that particular and specific question in our last study. Now, I want to begin by pointing out the huge problem that domestic abuse and violence is in the world. In Western countries like Australia and England and America, 1 in 4 families, 1 in 4 couples experience domestic abuse and violence. And when you get on the world scene, the United Nations puts the figure at 1 in 3, or to be exact, 35%. And when you get to the instance of abuse in minority groups in Western countries, what the Americans call people of colour or Indigenous people, the figures just zoom right off the chart. I've mentioned how I've travelled in Africa and India and Southeast Asia. I could tell you story after story about the abuse of women in these countries. But because I'm speaking as Australian, and probably most of my listeners will be people living in Western democracies, I'll focus most of all on the scene that we know ourselves. In the United Kingdom, 2 women are murdered each week by their intimate partner. In the USA, 3 women a day are killed by their intimate partner. What is so horrific is that a woman is far more likely to be abused, raped, hospitalised or killed by someone who says he loves her than by a stranger. Now, these awful figures have just exponentially increased in our COVID-19 lockdowns. In Australia, domestic violence hotlines in the last 6 months have increased 30%. And in 60% of these calls, it's been violence in the home for the first time. In the United Kingdom, domestic violence hotlines have received 40% more calls in the last couple of months. Now, the figures of domestic abuse in the general population are absolutely awful, but the awful thing for us Christians, especially evangelical Christians, is all the evidence seems to suggest that domestic abuse and violence in our churches is at much the same level. Now, the churches haven't wanted to know this, and so they haven't done a lot of research on this. But in the last few years, the evidence has come forward, overwhelming evidence, that domestic abuse and violence in church-going homes is much the same as it is in the wider world, and if anything, a little bit higher in evangelical and reformed churches. The worst offenders amongst evangelical and reformed churches are often the clergy. Now, until very recently, our leaders denied this. In fact, they said our teaching on male headship and female subordination actually counters this kind of thing. But in the wake of the Harvey Weinstein revelations, first on the hashtag #MeToo and then in the hashtag #ChurchToo, large numbers of evangelical women came forward to speak of the abuse by evangelical men, some of them clergy, in their home. 2 large denominational churches were caught in the spotlight. Firstly, the Southern Baptist Convention in the United States, and then secondly, the Anglican Diocese of Sydney. Both of these are evangelical and reformed by confession and complementarian by conviction. I mean by this, they believe men should lead in the church and the home, and women should be submissive in all things. For decades, the leaders of these churches have vehemently denied that abuse and violence occur in their homes, and their teaching on the headship of men and submission of women could encourage and legitimate domestic abuse and violence. Indeed, they claimed this very teaching excluded these things. It's now clearly seen that this is patently untrue. In both churches, violence and the abuse of women is endemic. For documentation of this, you need to read my little book, The Headship of Men and the Abuse of Women. Now, because many of you will find it very difficult to accept what I've said, I encourage you to search out accounts of domestic violence and abuse by Christian men, including some pastors. I make this plea because far too many conservative evangelical leaders are hugely resistant to accepting that domestic abuse and violence are all too common in families that regularly attend church and in ministers' homes. They are hugely resistant to acknowledging that domestic violence and abuse is predominantly a male sin, and hugely resistant to the argument that headship submission teaching can encourage and legitimate domestic abuse and violence. Today, there are innumerable true life accounts in books and articles, especially online, by Christian women on how they have been abused by their Christian husband, some of them evangelical pastors. No story is more telling than that of Ruth Tucker in a little book, Black and White Bible, Black and Blue Wife. Others are going to talk about this Bible. She was married to a charming, in public, pastor, evangelical pastor, who in private terribly abused her and bashed her. Now, we need to define what we're talking about. I first of all want to make a clear distinction between domestic violence and domestic abuse, two things that are often conflated. By the way, I'm speaking about heterosexual couple relationships, not same-sex relationships. Homosexual couple relationships have high levels of violence, but I haven't time to discuss this. The first known use of the term domestic violence to speak of violence in a couple relationship was in a report to the British Parliament in 1973. Yes, 1973. This report to the United Kingdom Parliament, most reports by police and much research literature on domestic violence, it refers exclusively to physical violence, hitting, slapping, punching, throwing things, wounding and killing. In recent times, just the last few years, the term domestic violence has taken a wider meaning to refer to physical violence and verbal, emotional, psychological and financial abuse. It's now often a catch-all term to speak of the ill treatment of women by their partner or ex-partner. I do not support this usage. I find the use of the term domestic violence to speak of what does not necessarily involve physical violence is unhelpful and confusing. I think it's much more helpful to take the term domestic abuse as the catch-all term, seeing physical violence as but one expression of the determination by some men to completely dominate and control the woman they say they love. Now let me define domestic abuse. It often does involve physical violence, but many abused women may never be punched, never slapped, never choked, never have anything thrown at them, never be threatened by a knife, yet they live in constant fear of their partner. They live in dread of the next outburst of anger directed at them. They know they are not free to see and do what they like, go where they wish, or spend money as they choose. And sex, instead of being a loving self-giving of oneself, is all too often something that makes them feel used and abused. They know the man who says he loves them is determined to have his own way at any cost. He wants to control them and how they think and what they do. Let me illustrate this contrast between domestic violence and domestic abuse in this diagram. In my book, The Headship of Men and the Abuse of Women, I constantly speak of domestic violence and abuse, two things with one aim: to dominate and control one's intimate partner or ex-partner. Now I come to another matter that has to be carefully defined and explained because there's much confusion on this. I know a very well-informed woman who regularly speaks at secular forums and at church groups on domestic violence. She always makes the point that most domestic violence and the worst violence comes at the hand of the man. She tells me that before she has finished speaking, there is someone, a man or a woman, waving their hand madly, wanting to get in the first question. This first question is always, aren't women just as violent in marriage as men? Or I know a woman who always speaks rudely to her husband, or something like this. The so-called men's rights movement claim that 1 in 3 women are violent to the man they live with. Now a nuanced reply is demanded. We must admit that some women can say awful things to their husband, hit him, and even kill him. What we're talking about is what the experts call situational couple violence. Women at the end of their tether, usually because of the abuse of the man in their life, can swear at him, hit him, stab him, and even murder him. Now, 3 moderating comments. First, there is of course a great difference between a slap or a push by a woman than a man. When it comes to violence, men are the heavyweight champions of the world. Women end up in hospital with black eyes, broken arms, bruised ribs. Men do not. This little illustration illustrates the difference between male and female violence. Second, when violence in a couple relationship occurs, men by a long shot are the most frequent perpetrators. Male violence tends to be habitual. And thirdly, when a woman stabs or kills her partner, in virtually every case, she does so in fear of her own life. But it's not only that violence in a home is non-gender specific, even if it's very different in nature, but so too is nastiness. Some men and some women, even if they're not violent, can be awful to live with. They're bad-tempered, selfish, lazy, vindictive, and just plain unpleasant. Men who have to endure such behaviour from their wife or partner call this female bitchiness. Women who have to endure such behaviour from their male partner often think this is just how all men behave. What we're talking about in this instance is the conflictual marriage. It may involve physical violence, but not necessarily so. Sometimes the man is the worst offender, sometimes the woman is the worst offender. Often both are at fault. So we can agree some women can be violent in their home, but this violence cannot be compared with the violence some men inflict on the one they say they love, and we can agree that some men and some women are not nice to live with. Now, what about domestic abuse, what I'm talking about? This is a specific phenomenon. It does not speak of an occasional incident of denigrating language or a slap or a hit, as in situational couple violence, or simply of a conflictual marriage. Domestic abuse refers to the ongoing assertion of power by one party over another. For heterosexual couples, almost always by the man over the woman, that has as its intent the complete control of the woman. This need not be physical violence for domestic abuse to be present, but always the woman fears what the man will say or do. Domestic abuse, by definition, is about exerting power in one way or another. It's characterised by ongoing controlling patterns of behaviour in which the man's identity as leader is asserted and enforced. In my little book about the headship of men and the abuse of women, I define domestic abuse in this way: the ongoing assertion of power, almost always by a man over his wife or intimate partner, that has as its intent the complete control of the woman. Men behave like this because they have more power than women in innumerable ways. They are, on average, physically stronger than women, more prone to violence, usually control the family finances, and can force sex on the woman. Most importantly, it is men who believe that because they are men, they should be in control. They should be the head of the home and their wife submissive. In heterosexual couples, domestic abuse is gendered. In almost every case, it's a man thing. Virtually all abusers as I have defined this term carefully, are men. Proof of this is seen in that men do not flee the home with their children in fear of their life and the life of their children. And there are no refuges for men fleeing domestic abuse, but refuges for women are found all over the world. I'm a man. I'm not denigrating all men. Most men do not insist on their own way in the home at any cost, and they are not abusive or violent. They are loving, caring, and respectful partners, brothers, fathers, friends, and colleagues. This is what I want to be, as do most men. However, a significant percentage of men are violent and are abusive towards the woman they say they love. They seek to control her in whatever ways they can. Sadly, I must admit that some Christian men, many of evangelical conviction, follow this path, claiming the Bible makes them the head of the home and their wives should be submissive to them in all things, as St. Paul says. Well, I must conclude. In my second talk, I'll discuss the causes, or better, the drivers of domestic abuse and violence. Why some men, and some Christian men, abuse the woman they say they love. And in my last and third presentation, I'll ask the question, does the Bible make the leadership of men and the submission of women the creation ideal, as complementarians argue? Or does the Bible make the rule of men and the submission of women the fallen reality to be opposed by Christians, as I argue?
Scars Across Humanity is a must-read for anyone who cares about this issue. However, Elaine has since written another book. Actually, she's written loads of books, and her latest is called Women in a Patriarchal World. And scattered throughout the day, she's going to introduce us to 3 characters from her book. They're all amazing women. Some of them we'll already know of, others we may not. I'm sure we've all heard of Noah, but did you know there's another Noah in the Bible? And this Noah did not build an ark, and this Noah is a woman. This Noah had the Mosaic law changed, and we want to find out more, so stay tuned. But firstly, let's let Elaine speak for herself and introduce us to her book.
Well, I know we're all very sad that we can't meet in person at Press Red this year and just enjoy one another's company like we usually do. But at least we can put some things online. And I'm Elaine Storkey, and the organisers have asked me to talk about my book, Women in a Patriarchal World, which was actually launched during lockdown. It was a very small launch, as you can imagine, because no one could come. Now, in the book, I'm doing 2 things. First of all, I'm really trying to help people to engage with the scriptures and a bit of narrative theology, what it's like to actually read the scriptures and get inside the stories. But the second thing, I'm challenging an idea that many people have, that the Bible is a very patriarchal document, that it's written by men for men, and it's male dominant. And women are only interpreted by men, and often in a very bad way and very poor light. They're always subordinate or submissive. And in the stories that I tell, 25 Bible readings, a lot of these women are anything but subordinate and submissive. And even though the culture is patriarchal, the women are not actually cowed by the patriarchy, but in many ways have stories of their own, which are told in the pages of the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament. So it's 25 Bible readings, incorporating about 30 women, and all of these women have challenges to face, and challenges because of the sheer patriarchy of the society in which they're enclosed.
So let's get right to it and meet Noah and her sisters in the first of the women living in a patriarchal world that we're going to hear about today.
Elaine Storkey here with the first of her 3 stories from Women in a Patriarchal World, a book I launched during lockdown. And this story can be found in Numbers 27 and later in Joshua 17. And I wonder if the names of these women means anything to you. Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah and Tirzah. I suspect they don't. And that's partly because we don't read the book of Numbers very much. But it's also because in many ways they're lost in history. So who were they? Well, they were 5 spunky sisters. And they were the daughters of Zelophehad, who had actually been part of the tribes of Israel. Now, we need to understand the background of this story. The people of Israel have been wandering in the desert for 40 years, and now they're in sight of the promised land. And God tells Moses, take a second census. The first census was 38 years ago. Most of the people on the census will probably be dead by now. And Moses needs to know how much land to allocate, how big the tribes are, how many people, how many men are going to serve in the army, and so on. And so the second census is very, very important. Now, the first census only had male names because it's a patriarchal society. Women are subsumed under the men. And the second census had male names too, and that left the daughters of Zelophehad in quite a quandary because they had no male heirs. Their father had died. They had no brother. They had no uncle who would take on the father's line. And they felt that this was profoundly unjust. They were actually eliminated from the land. Their title was eliminated. Their name would disappear. And they would have to eke out a living by marrying into another tribe or in some such capacity. And they thought it was very unjust. Now, women in patriarchal societies don't have many options, and mostly what women would do in that situation would complain, would go and grumble to other women, wandering in and out of people's tents and saying this isn't fair, but not much else. These women weren't like that. They decided this was fundamentally unjust. And they couldn't square it with the God that they knew and worshipped. So they did the enormously bold step of approaching Moses and Eleazar and all the leaders in the sacred tent of meeting. Women didn't go there, but they did. They approached the sacred tent of meeting and they put their case. And their case was very well argued. Look, they said, our father was a loyal Jew. He served the people. He wasn't an insurrectionist. He did everything that was right, and he died in the desert. And so we're now without lineage, and we are going to be eradicated from the tribes of Israel. Our name is not going to survive. Please give us the land that was due to our father, and we will divide it up between us. Well, that's an extraordinary challenge for Moses' leadership. And what does he do? And many people in that situation would have said, push off. This is our decision, not yours. You're women. We don't have to listen to you. We make the rules. Moses didn't. He decided he wasn't qualified, he wasn't equipped to decide this case without first going back to God and praying to God and pleading to God, give me wisdom in this case. And that's precisely what he did. He prayed and God said to him, and it's amazing how what God said is recorded in the scriptures for us. It's written down very, very carefully. God said, you, Zelophehad's daughters are right. You must give them property of their own amongst their father's relatives. Turn their father's property over to them. And even more than that, this became more than a simple individual case for 5 women. It became a universal rule for the people of Israel. And that's precisely what happened. When you read the book of Joshua, the law is implemented and Zelophehad's children, daughters, get their land. And they also get the right to choose their own spouse from within their father's line. So it's altogether a wonderful conclusion. And what can we learn from it today? Well, first of all, we can learn that these women were single and they treasured their singleness. They didn't simply want to be identified as married women and therefore have status and purpose because they were married. They wanted to be who they were. And elevating women's singleness is really quite important. And I think it's important for Christian women and in the church today to recognise that we have a purpose and we have a calling irrespective of our marital status. But secondly, these women understood justice. And when the law of the land, when the law of the elders clashed with what they believed to be the justice heart of God, they knew that there's something wrong. And what was wrong was not God. It was the law of the elders, and they took this forward. And being justice seekers is a very important calling for women, and that's what we're asked to be today. where we see things wrong, where we see them clashing with the fundamental will of God for liberty, freedom, love, justice, equality, then we have to react against it. We have to be justice bringers in our situation, not just for our own cause, but for the cause of those who have no voices. So a lot to learn from these five sisters, and 2 more stories still to come. Thanks for listening.
As I said previously, I started leading Press Red in March, about the same time that Tim Napper became one of our trustees. And he's just taken on the responsibility of being head of the board of trustees. You know, Tim and I have dreams and we have visions for Press Red. And we had a chat about it on Zoom, and we recorded the conversation. I'm going to play it for you now so that you can learn more about our dreams and our visions for Press Red.
So it's my pleasure to introduce Tim Napper to you. Tim, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself and why you took up the role of the chair of the trustees board.
Yeah, hi Rose. Nice to see you and talk on this conference day. I guess right at the beginning of Press Red, I heard Michelle Hawthorne talking about her heart's cry, I guess, really, for gender-based violence, abuse against women and girls. And whilst not knowing much about it, my wife was involved in the first conference. I ended up helping, and therefore got to listen to a lot of what was going on. And I think it was just at the start, just seeing the enormity of the challenge of gender-based violence. And having stayed involved, one thing led to another, sort of getting more aware of the problem, and getting involved with the trustees of Press Red just felt a way to be involved and to serve.
And what's your background? What do you do when you're not being a Press Red trustee?
Yeah, so I guess very different. I'm a general manager in industrial big global company. So I get involved in sales and marketing. I get involved in technology. I get involved in running a business across Northern Europe. So, very different. I guess over the years, one of the things that I've enjoyed is traveling a lot and seeing different cultures and countries. And I guess mixed with that, home life is, I have a wife and 3 daughters. So it's quite a female orientated household over the years. And so I guess all of that mixed together, when you then start talking about some of the challenges in society, some of the things are not right and need some focus, where there's injustice. And I guess at the end of the day, where there's injustice and where there's pain and suffering, it actually affects those communities as well. And there's a loss in those communities. So, this is a key area that we need to raise awareness over, and to get more people conscious of what is actually the situation out there.
Right. So I guess you've summed up also some of your dreams for Press Red. Anything sort of specific that where you see Press Red fitting in to fill this gap?
Yeah, I think there's many things. And certainly the starting point is getting people aware of the situation of what is going on, and getting more people to that point where they will press red. They'll say, stop, enough is enough, and we need to do something. I think more recently, having got into it more, one of the areas that I'm really keen that we advance and make progress in is getting particularly men to see the extent of this problem and the fact that something needs to be done. Because obviously men typically are perpetrators here. Mm-hmm. I think it's easy for maybe women to get involved because there's a natural link there. But I think, it is time that men stand up, and we need to get that message across. Just switching around to you, Rose, as well, and just finding a little bit about your background. I know you've been involved in some of these areas before you came to Press Red. And obviously we were very excited a number of months ago to know that you're going to take the lead here at Press Red. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about that as well.
Right. I mean, I have known about Press Red since it started because I know Michelle.
Mm.
For myself, I have been working overseas for the last 40 years and just relocated to the UK about a year and a half, 2 years ago. I have been working with an organization called Operation Mobilization, and I still work with them. I've been leading a ministry called AIDS Link, which is very closely connected with OM around HIV and AIDS. And I think as a woman in leadership and also working in the area of HIV and AIDS, this whole issue of gender abuse, gender discrimination, sexism, misogyny, etc., became something that I became very bothered about. It's not the way it should be. And I don't like things that aren't the way they should be. So
Yeah.
it was kind of natural for me to get involved in Press Red when I moved back here. So yeah, that's my background on it.
Yeah, no, there's a great fit there, and I think there's a lot of experience that Press Red is going to get the benefit from. Yeah, so having, I guess, been involved for the last 6 months and a little bit more, maybe, what are some of the key projects that you're looking forward to taking forward with Press Red, and maybe some of your expectations for the next couple of years?
Right. Well, all my expectations changed because I had all these expectations that we're doing grid and doing control and doing all these wonderful things, and then even working with the team and leading the team, and then we had this lockdown. So it's like, what next? Now, in some ways, that gave me a chance to get to know Press Red a little bit and think about what we could do online. So we started the online prayer meeting, which happens once a month. And we tackle a different area of abuse against women in each meeting. It's 1 hour long. If people want to come, they can sign up to get the newsletter and we'll tell them about it. But that's one very simple way to respond, is obviously asking God to intervene in the situation. Also, the Pressing Red course we launched around the time I took over, which is quite an in-depth look about to abuse against women. It's 6 weeks, 2-hour sessions, and then about 2 hours of homework between the sessions. And the idea was to do it face-to-face in small groups, but it has been very easily transferred online. Now, it's actually quite a heavy course if this is your first exposure. So what we're also working on is kind of a lighter version of it that people could use more as an introduction to the issue, which we'll also be able to run online or in person. We're also looking at programs that we had been talking about 6 months ago, and then we put them on hold. And I think now is the time where we can really start acting on some of them, like the Befrienders program. So you've got women who are in refuges and they need a friend. So, get people who want to get alongside people who can not exactly counsel, but just encourage people and motivate them and be a friend to them. So we want to start getting that program up and running. We were looking at a program working with vulnerable young girls. And again, that is something, hopefully March or so, we're looking at launching that. We should be able to do it in a COVID secure way. The Resource Centre, of course, which is going to be live after today's conference, which is a massive project that we've been working on for quite a while. And that is going to be a living document. We've got Annalisa talking more about what that is in this conference today. And we've also got somebody talking more about what Pressing Red course is in the conference later on today. Okay. So those are some of my dreams and visions. I think the one thing I also want to start doing is really tackling some of the roots of abuse against women, which is the theme of this conference. And I think, we can run around tackling all the problems, but we also need to speak out against the roots, and we need to be involved in that. Somehow I think Press Red fits in the gap between some of the stuff that's happening in refuges and things like that, and some of the organizations that work against FGM, child brides and things, in raising the awareness of the issue. So it's kind of we're filling a bit of a gap there, I think.
Yeah. That sounds excellent. I think the conference, if it's like the previous ones in previous years, will really help people to understand the different areas of gender-based violence. And I think the challenge after that is to really draw something that individually that we can take away and do. I know I did the Press Red course a number of months ago. It's meaty, but it was really good in terms of just getting that understanding and getting yourself in a place where you felt you really could understand what's going on and wanted to take some personal action as well.
Right, and people can find out information about that on our website.
Yeah.
So, great, thanks, Tim. Nice to chat.
Good.
Can't believe you're only about a mile away. But
Yeah.
to meet this way.
Well, that's what the pandemic does to us.
It does.
Nice to chat with you as well, Rose.
Right. Bye.
Bye-bye.
One of the exciting projects that we've been dreaming of is starting a digital resource centre. And at this conference, we are launching it. It's a work in progress. It's going to be a live site. Things will be uploaded to it. It will grow. It will be developed. But I want to introduce you to another PressRed team member and the person responsible for making this work. Annalisa Takara is our head of campaigns. She handles social media, she handles the website and so on, and many other things. Annalisa is generally involved in making the world a better place, both inside and outside of PressRed. Annalisa, please tell us more about the Digital Resource Centre.
Hi, I'm Annalisa Takara. I'm Head of Campaigns, Policy and Communications at PressRed. I'm delighted to introduce our PressRed Digital Resource Centre. The Digital Resource Centre is a fantastic tool in engaging and equipping individuals, organisations and churches on the issues of gender-based violence. It's been a dream of PressRed for a while to create a digital resource centre where all sorts of resources are combined in one to raise awareness on gender-based violence. The Digital Resource Centre is a live, ongoing, updatable site available at pressredresources.org. We have partnered with a variety of organisations to highlight and showcase materials on gender-based violence, such as podcasts, videos, articles and books, which can help aid in equipping and educating. The Digital Resource Centre will grow as we add to it monthly, and we will be circulating the resources and links via our social media. We will also have an Author of the Month who will share their tips and their views with us on gender-based violence. Please have a look at the website and let us know what you think about it and what you would love to see in the Digital Resource Centre. There will also be a directory button which you can press and search for organisations in your area on topics to do with gender-based violence.
Thanks, Annalisa. It's time to get our notebooks back out and hear from Kevin again. This time he's talking about the drivers or the roots of violence and abuse against women. By the way, just for clarity, when we talk about violence, we're including other abuses, such as psychological, financial, and so on, because they're actually all acts of violence, although they may not be physical. And when we talk about abuse, we're including physical violence. So we are using the term somewhat interchangeably. Kevin, over to you.
Now we ask in this second session two related questions. Why do some men, some of them evangelical and reformed Christians, abuse the woman they say they love? There is much agreement today in the scholarly literature as to why some men abuse the woman they say they love. There is a primary reason in every case, what we might call the macro level cause or driver, which is solitary. And secondly, there are reasons why particular men are violent and abusive, what we might call micro level drivers, which differ from man to man. This two-sided and multi-dimensional explanation of what drives so many men to be abusive is called the ecological explanatory model. Before I go further, I need to say something about the word cause. Nothing causes in the sense of makes someone abusive. Men living in starkly patriarchal cultures, men with wounded psyches, men who get angry quickly, men who drink too much, men whose dad abused their mother, are not necessarily abusive of the woman they live with. Some are not. Thus, in this usage, the word cause carries the weaker sense of what may produce abuse in an intimate relationship. To overcome the problems with this word, many researchers speak rather of drivers, What drives someone to go in a certain direction? Now, the macro level and primary driver. The scholarly literature is almost unanimous. The most basic and most important driver is the belief held by so many men that they should be in charge. Men, because they are men, should run things, and women, because they are women, should be submissive. Let me give a little bit of the evidence. First of all, I quote from an article by Professors Heisey and Constam in the 215 Lancet Journal. This sums up the evidence based on 66 surveys in 44 countries involving 481 subjects. The scope of this study is truly impressive, and they conclude especially predictive of partner violence are norms related to male authority, where communities believe that men are privileged and should be in control and women submissive. Women in much higher percentages are abused. Next, I quote Liz Wall in her well-researched article, Gender Equality and Violence Against Women. She sums up the scholarly consensus in this way, I quote, "A lack of gender equality is consistently cited as an underlying determinant of violence against women. The United Nations General Assembly, in its 1993 Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, noted that this violence is a manifestation of historically unequal power relations between men and women. Gender inequality as a cause of violence against women underpins approaches to prevention by organisations such as the World Health Organization." Jess Hill, an Australian journalist who has written a 400-page book on the abuse of women, See What You Made Me Do, says, quote, "It is indisputable that traditional notions of masculinity, particularly male entitlement, are at the core of men's violence against women. Our Watch, an Australian organisation set up to counter abuse of women, says, quote, "Research has consistently found that men who hold traditional, hierarchical views about gender roles and relationships are more likely to perpetuate violence against women." And lastly and importantly, I quote Professor Stephen Tracy, a well-known conservative evangelical American theologian. He says, "Models of patriarchy, which give husbands the greatest levels of power and authority, are most likely to stimulate domestic violence. And there is abundant data showing that the conceptions of gender in which males are viewed as superior to females and in which males are attributed greater power to control females are predicators of increased levels of domestic abuse." In this last quote, Professor Tracy identifies complementarianism with patriarchy, as do many leading complementarians. For example, Denny Burke, the chairman of the Council of Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, the flagship of the complementarian movement, says, and I quote, "Biblical patriarchy isn't such a bad description of our beliefs. It is simply what the scriptures teach about manhood and womanhood." End of quote. The patriarchal premise that men should lead, women be submissive, is as old as humankind, and it still prevails in many parts of the world. It is reflected in all the holy writings of all the great religions of the world, including Christianity. This is to be expected because all these writings were written by those who assumed patriarchy. It was for them the taken for granted reality. This means religion can powerfully reinforce patriarchal beliefs, and specifically it can be used to justify men's asserting their authority and control over women. For religion to become a liberating force in opposition to domestic abuse and violence against women, the leaders of each religion need to accept that what they find in their scriptures that seems to endorse male privilege is only a reflection of a past age, never the ideal. In answer to the argument that patriarchal beliefs, whether or not religion is involved, are the foundational and primary cause of domestic abuse and violence, critics of this point out that in modern Western societies, with their ever-growing gender equality, domestic abuse and violence against women still remains pervasive. The Nordic countries are often cited. In these countries, gender equality is pursued rigorously. They are sometimes called gender equal utopias. Yet domestic abuse and violence hover around 30%, a high figure because Nords are eager to report abuse. So-called men's rights groups and evangelical complementarians make much of this fact, arguing that it proves that gender inequality is not the primary cause of domestic abuse and violence against women. This is not a compelling argument. We should expect violence against women to increase when men feel their power and control is slipping away. We should expect the empowerment of women to make men in patriarchal cultures and needy and controlling men in Western egalitarian cultures more anxious about their status. We should expect some men to feel their masculinity is being threatened when women act independently and assertively. And we should expect a backlash against the emancipation of women by many men. In migrant communities that have come from patriarchal cultures to Australia and other Western countries, we see examples of what I've just argued. The new freedoms that women find in their new culture often lead to their abuse as their husbands sense their power over their wives is slipping away from them. Now let me talk about what's called micro-level drivers, or what makes particular men abusive and violent. Until recently, most books and articles coming from the first world on domestic abuse and violence focused mainly on individual causation. This is not at all surprising because Western societies are profoundly individualistic. One of the most common explanations at an individual level is that something is wrong with the mind of male abusers to make them behave in this controlling and abusive way. The wiring of their brains is different to most men. The problem with this explanation is that many abusive men, if not most, in public act very normally. Another common explanation as to why some men are violent and abusive is they feel powerless as men. They feel inadequate. Because they feel powerless as a man, they seek to exert power over their intimate partner to assuage their sense of powerlessness. The minute they feel their power is under threat, they come out fighting. To put it succinctly, male abusers are often needy men. Another common explanation as to why some men are abusive and violent is they cannot control their anger. Lundy Bancroft, in his superb book, Why Does He Do That?, in the minds of angry and controlling men, he helpfully discusses this explanation. He argues that abusing men are not exceptionally angry men, but rather men who have learned that anger enables them to get their own way. It is a means to an end. He says, we all get angry at times, but that doesn't necessarily lead to violence and abuse. Alcohol is given also as a cause of much domestic abuse and violence, and certainly it's an important contributor in many instances. Alcohol is a disinhibitor, allowing people to behave in ways they would not be happy to behave when not inebriated. In other words, when a man has drunk too much, his controlling and abusive tendencies can easily be given free rein. Finally, I mentioned the impact of witnessed abuse and violence in the home on children. For daughters, this is an absolutely awful experience that never leaves them and often crushes their sense of self-worth as a woman, and all too often leads to them marrying an abusive man. Sons, on their part, who see their father abusing their mother and being violent, are far more likely to later abuse their wife or their partner. Lundy Bancroft says, quote, boys who grow up in homes where their mother is battered are more likely than other boys to grow up to abuse and be violent to their wives and girlfriends. This may be called the intergenerational transmission of domestic abuse and violence. Now, to sum up on causation, what is so helpful with the ecological explanation model is that we do not have to choose between macro and micro explanations, or between one micro explanation and another to explain abusive behaviour in individual men. We can concede that many things can cause or drive a man to be abusive and violent towards the woman he says he loves. We do know for certain, nevertheless, that all abusive men have a sense of privilege. They all believe that because they are a man, they should be in control. They should make all the important decisions and their wife should be submissive. The macro or individual drivers of domestic abuse and violence simply personalised how this primary belief is expressed. Now, to the complementarians. What we have just argued is the primary driver for male abuse is a sense of entitlement. I am a man. I should be in charge and my wife should be submissive. The problem for evangelical and reformed Christians is that this is exactly what complementarians teach. Men should be in charge simply because they are men and for no other reason, and women should be submissive because they are women and for no other reason. This, they assert, is, quote, what the Bible clearly teaches, end of quote. This conclusion that headship teaching can encourage and legitimate domestic abuse in Christians' homes is vehemently rejected by complementarians. They tell us, quote, the least likely group of men to engage in domestic violence are those who attend evangelical churches regularly. Or they tell us male headship is, quote, good for women, good for children and good for families, end of quote. At the annual Southern Baptist Convention meeting in Dallas in 2018, where some 8,000 delegates were present, a resolution was passed condemning domestic abuse, yet at the same time asserting that headship teaching, quote, neither supports nor fosters, but rather prevents and condemns abuse, end of quote. Similarly, Mark Thompson, the principal of Moore Theological College, says, quote, biblical headship and submission is not the cause of domestic abuse. It is in fact quite the opposite. Now, the problem for complementarians is that these assertions are patently false. In recent years, innumerable Christian women have come forward to say unambiguously and starkly, in one way or another, something like this. My husband believes God has put him in charge in our home and I must obey him. He believes his job is to lead and mine is to do as I'm told. He always quotes the Bible in support. In every book and article I read, written by women who had been abused in the homes where their husband went to church, women are quoted as saying, my abusive and violent husband constantly appeals to scriptural teaching on male headship and wifely submission to justify his behaviour. In all my personal encounters over 40 years of pastoral ministry, every violent and abusive man always quoted the Bible in support of his behaviour. So it's simply a fact that complementarian headship submission teaching can both encourage and legitimate the abuse of a wife. It can lead men to think that they should be in charge because they are a man, and women should obey simply because they are women. And if women do not comply, they should be reminded of, quote, what the Bible clearly teaches. Wives are to be submissive in all things, and they are to obey their husbands. At this point, there's no avoiding that there is a relationship between domestic abuse and violence, and the belief that men should be the head of the home and women be submissive in all things. Scholarly studies on domestic abuse and violence are virtually agreed that the primary driver of this scourge is a sense of male entitlement, the belief that men should lead simply because they are men and women should be submissive simply because they are women. And this is exactly what complementarians teach. If the abuse of women is to be seriously counted in society and in our churches, the belief that men should be in charge and women always submissive has to be rejected. In my last presentation, I will tackle this very emotive question. The question is this: does the Bible make the leadership of men and the submission of women in all things the creation ideal? Or does the Bible make the rule of men and the submission of women the fallen reality to be opposed by Christians? The alternatives could not be starker, and the consequences for women could not be more significant.
So Kevin has really set out some of the evidence and some of the research and the studies that have been done on this. I find it very challenging what he says. I appreciate very much what he says about the way a man is raised can be a driver of violence, but it doesn't have to be. Because many men have a less than perfect upbringing but would never abuse anyone, let alone somebody that they love. Earlier in the year, I was contacted by a lady called Emma Grant, who is part of the Message UK. That's where we're filming today. Emma works in one of their inner city projects, and she's a musician. And she wrote this song in response to the domestic abuse that she heard drifting through her open window one summer evening.
Hi, my name's Emma Grant. I'm going to sing a song for you that I've just written called Staying for Love. Throughout my life, I've known people who've been in abusive relationships, and I've also known people who've worked with victims of domestic abuse, and it's always been something that's broken my heart. When this song was written, I was actually just hanging the washing out and I heard a scream in the distance, and it actually turned out not to be anything sinister, but it really stirred something in me, and within about 2 hours I'd written this song. It got me thinking about the passage in Corinthians that a lot of people have read out at their wedding, and it talks about what love is. And in the song I look at, if now we know what love is, what love isn't as well. I think my hope with the song is that it inspires people to get out of a relationship if it is abusive, and also maybe if you've had your view of love distorted, that it brings a new clarity to what love really is.
When you first met, sparks would fly, you're feeling high, you'll stay together on cloud nine. You felt so special. All you do is find a way to be together every day. And when those times came, you told yourself you felt no pain. If you're staying for love, don't do that. Love shouldn't hurt you. If you're staying just because, don't do that. You don't deserve to. It was just the one time. You told yourself while trying to shelf the feeling of losing yourself. It was much or little fist. So next time you'll know which way is safe to go. If you're staying for love, don't do that. Love shouldn't hurt you. If you're staying just because, don't do that. You don't deserve to. Love is patient and kind. It doesn't remind of mistakes in the past, making the pain last. It's not jealous or proud. It doesn't boast to a crowd. It won't fly into rage when you're not on the same page. It speaks words that are true, wants to protect you, not raise up a hand so you can no longer stand. And it trusts and it hopes to keep dreams alive. It doesn't drag you down so you can barely survive. Now time has gone by. You've learned to smile amongst the crowd, your inner voice screaming so loud, a shadow of who you were. It's normal now, it's been so long, you're used to feeling in the wrong. But maybe one day you'll get the chance to have your say. If you're staying for love, don't do that. Love shouldn't hurt you. If you're staying just because, don't do that. You don't deserve to. If you're staying for love, don't do that. Love shouldn't hurt you. And if you're staying just because, don't do that. You don't deserve to.
I don't really need to introduce our next guest. He's quite well known around here. He has a few claims to fame. One is that he is the founder of the Message Trust and the director of the Message Trust, but that's kind of irrelevant because his main claim to fame is that he is the husband of Michelle Hawthorne, who founded Press Red, and consequently he's seen Press Red right from its inception, right to the present day.
Hi there, my name's Andy Hawthorne and I'm married to Michelle, the founder of Press Red. Press Red started officially about 4 years ago as a charity, but I know for a fact Press Red actually started in Michelle's heart decades before. Over the last 20 plus years, God's been breaking Michelle's heart around violence and injustice against women. It's on God's heart, and I've seen her nailed in various meetings. I've seen her have remarkable prophetic words that she's going to become an advocate, a voice for women who can't speak for themselves. She's going to speak out around violence and injustice to women in a beautiful way. I've seen it prophesied, and now I'm starting to see it take place. I love the fact that Press Red runs on a small budget. It's not looking to deliver massive programs, but rather signpost people towards other amazing charities who are experts in this area. I love the fact that Press Red is passionate volunteers coming together. And I love the fact that their heart is to turn the silence off, to shine a light on all sorts of desperate situations women are struggling with. You see, Satan loves to operate in the dark. Unless we shine a light on what he's doing, he's just going to carry on doing his wicked schemes among women all over the world. And Press Red are called to shine a light, to turn the silence off. But they can't turn the silence off unless we turn the finance on. And right now, Press Red, as they look to step up the work, yes, employ more people who will be advocates for for hurting women. Yes, campaign on their behalf. Yes, run conferences like this one. They can't do any of this business of turning the silence off unless we turn the finance on. Myself and Michelle are privileged to regularly support Press Red, and I couldn't really think of a better thing to do. Today, sign up a regular gift towards this beautiful charity. Let's make a mark in this generation. And we all probably know, if you've been watching any of the talks today, you'll know women are, as ever, taking the worst hit from this pandemic. There's more domestic violence. There's more pain around the world. We can make a mark. We can stand with this charity and regularly give. There's a link on the screen that you can click. Whatever you're able to do, a regular monthly gift at this time would be a huge blessing. Go for it, Press Red. Make a difference. Speak on behalf of these women who can't speak for themselves. And let's stand with them financially and do something beautiful in this generation. Thank you very much.
You know, ongoing monthly gifts are our bread and butter. If today 25 people signed up to give us £25 a month, that would make a huge difference to us. We've got dreams, we've got visions, we've shared some of them with you. Andy's mentioned some of them. We spoke about the resource centre. We want to start a programme to befriend people who are abused. We want to start work with young women at risk. Many of you have seen the drama Control. Wouldn't it be fantastic to film that? We want to resume many of our pre-lockdown activities as soon as we can. But, you know, this all costs money. And it's going to take a lot of money if we want to make these dreams a reality. And we want you to be a part of that and partner with us financially. This screen has a link to giving, to our webpage and how to give. We're going to leave it up for 5 minutes. This 5 minutes is not for a tea break. It's a chance to give you a chance to respond and to give to Press Red right now. There are many forms of abuse and violence against women. One of the most violent and awful is female genital mutilation, or FGM. I realise this is a daytime conference, so I'm not going to go into the gruesome details. If you want to learn more, you can go to the website of 28 Too Many. That's one of the organisations that we network with. I've asked Pastor Charles to share a bit with us about his church and their response to FGM.
Female genital mutilation, or FGM, is practiced for a number of reasons, including cultural, religious, and social factors in many parts of Africa. Sadly, with migration, it means there are communities of migrants here in the UK who do practice FGM. Whereas there have been long-held beliefs among these communities that FGM cleanses women or young girls, and also FGM prepares young women for adulthood or becoming better mothers. Unfortunately, this hasn't been scientifically proven. So for those who hold on to the belief that FGM is the best thing that could happen to girls or young mothers, on the contrary, we've seen so many accounts of the adverse impact for those women who have undergone FGM. It's impacted on the confidence level of women. It's created complications during childbearing. And the list goes on and on and on. Over here in the UK, FGM is illegal. And the police and other agencies are working closely to ensure that those adults who hold on to those traditional beliefs and want their children to undergo that procedure will be prosecuted when they are found out. So my message as we think about the impact of FGM, modern slavery, and other things on vulnerable women is that the psychological effect, the emotional trauma, the physical pain that these vulnerable women go through as a result of procedures that are meted to them many years and sometimes decades is long-lasting and devastating. There is no evidence to substantiate the fact that women who undergo FGM become better mothers or better wives. So therefore, I appeal to the men who grew up from cultural backgrounds and were made to believe that the best wives they could have are women who have undergone FGM. Please, this is a lie. It's not been scientifically proven. You may believe and hold on to those cultural norms and those cultural beliefs. But on the other hand, this is illegal in the UK. So let us think about the adverse impact. Let us come to a place as men and as mothers and stop saying, my grandmother did it, my mother did it, I did it, and therefore my children or grandchildren need to undergo FGM. There are so much documented devastating impact. More so, FGM is illegal. Put a stop to it. Thank you.
Elaine writes about FGM in her book, Scars Across Humanity. But now we're going to hear her on something else. Another character from her new book, another woman who lived in a patriarchal world.
Hello, I'm back with the second story, this time from the New Testament. And it's chapter 14 of my book, Women in a Patriarchal World. And I've called this chapter a most embarrassing party. And you'll find the account in Luke chapter 7, verses 36 to 50. But I want to start by reading what I wrote in the book itself. You're at a garden party with some well-known celebrities and you've just sat down to eat. Your discreet gathering is sectioned off from the general public, but people are milling around close by and are quite free to stop and look across the barriers. Without warning, an uninvited woman rushes over and starts to make physical contact with one of the high-profile guests. She takes a jar of aroma oil out of her bag and starts kissing the guest's feet and giving them a massage. When she unpins her long hair, one of the other guests mutters that she is a local prostitute. The only person who seemed untroubled was the one at the centre of the encounter, Jesus himself. When the other guests began muttering and doubting his discernment and probably also his morality, he remarked rather pointedly that their own hospitality had been somewhat lacking. They had not given him water to wash his tired feet. They had not welcomed him with an embrace. They had not anointed his head with oil. But this woman had done all of these things, and she had made up for their lack of hospitality by her generous expression of gratitude towards him. So who was this woman? It's in Matthew, Mark and John of a woman anointing Jesus, but the account in Luke is different, and we need to ask some questions. What was the woman doing there in the first place? What led her to discard and disregard the protocols and rush over to give all this attention to Jesus' feet? What was she doing with an expensive box of perfume? And how could she be so sure that Jesus wouldn't rebuff her? I think the answers are in the text itself. First of all, she probably had already come under the ministry of Jesus because she's described as someone whose sins were forgiven and who has gratitude. And it's that gratitude to Jesus, therefore, that helps her to discard the protocols and actually express her love and gratitude for him publicly. But it's also possible that when she saw how he was being treated by his hosts, and shabbily, without real regard for his person, she wanted to compensate for that, and she wanted to make up for it for him, and he acknowledges that too. And then that box of perfume. Perfume is what prostitutes have for their very best clients, to bring them to arousal, to spend a lot of attention on them. And she brings it and puts it on Jesus' feet, the least important part of a human body in many ways, and she lavishes it on his dusty, dirty feet, not being put off by his smelly feet or anything like that. It's as if she's bringing her former trade, everything that she was in the past, and just laying it at Jesus' feet so she can walk freely from then onwards in a new way, and Jesus acknowledges this. And how could she know he didn't rebuff her? Because she'd already understood the nature of his forgiveness and the deep love that he has for people like her. What can we learn about the story today? I think there are so many things that we need to learn. And first of all, of course, that we need to recognise that Jesus receives us, receives our gifts, whoever we are, when we lay them before him, and he takes them and acknowledges them. But secondly, especially for women, that this woman was defined by a patriarchal society. Who she was made sense in that society, but that's not who she wanted to be. She wanted to be someone who was freed from patriarchy, free to be a woman in her own authentic right. And many of us are struggling with freedom, the needs of freedom to be ourselves in a patriarchal context. Women are often still defined, even within the church, as things that they cannot do. They cannot preach in some churches. They shouldn't speak in order. They shouldn't be elders. They shouldn't be leaders and so on. And actually, Jesus and the Holy Spirit empower us to be these things. Patriarchy does not define women, and it didn't define this woman, and it shouldn't define us. We are defined by our relationship with Jesus and through the power of the Holy Spirit. But thirdly, it's very important to know the freedom of our sins forgiven. This woman didn't want to hang on to her past life, didn't want to lug the things that bogged her down any longer. She wanted to be free from them. And if there are people watching this video knowing that there are things that they just want to let go of in their lives and walk free. I think the time has come for us to do the same and walk freely with Christ and know the power of the Holy Spirit to leave things behind and to move on. And finally, this story teaches us compassion for those women who have been trapped in the past and possibly still are in the present. Women who are in prostitution, women who are at the dregs of society, women who are struggling with lives that they don't want but actually can't get shut of. And very often it's a calling for Christians to work alongside these women, compassionately, lovingly, befriending them and helping them to exit, helping them to know the forgiveness of sins and the freedom that life in Christ brings for every one of us. Amen.
Just before we break for lunch, we're going to hear from one of our volunteers. Becky is going to talk to us about what to do if you or someone you know is in an abusive relationship.
So I've been asked to just say a few words about how to spot abuse. It's really important to recognise that abuse is not just physical. It can be financial, it can be emotional, it can be sexual. You might know somebody who's just got in a new relationship and things seem to be moving really fast. It could be coercive control. It could be that the person is becoming excessively jealous. The person could be policing what you wear, or you've noticed this sort of behaviour in a relationship that a family member or a friend is in. So what should you do in that situation? Well, obviously, if you think that person is at absolute risk, then do call the emergency services. You can call the police. If that person has agreed to confide in you, the most important thing you can do is listen. Tell her you believe her. Don't judge her if she's not ready to leave. It can take up to 7 attempts to leave before someone's ready. So just be there for that person. If that person's okay with it, you could have a code word that they would use if they were to call you, if they were in a dangerous situation, and then you would know to call the police. Don't be alone in this. Access services, there are a lot of specialist services out there, but one of the main numbers that you can call is the Refuge Domestic Abuse Helpline, which is 24/7, and the number for that is 0808 2000 247. And just remember, we might be in lockdown, but refuges are still open and you can leave your home if you are fleeing domestic abuse.
We're going to have a break now. It's some time for you to have lunch, time to run errands, do anything else you need to do. Before rejoining us at 2 p.m, I have a challenge for you. Take a walk around your block and pray for women in your neighbourhood who may be being abused. This afternoon, we're going to have more testimonies. We're hearing from Kevin again, and then we're going to hear from Esme Bouwers from South Africa on healing the gender divide. Have a good lunch break, and don't forget to take that walk around your neighbourhood, and don't forget to pray. There are people close to you who are in abusive relationships.